don't feel bad, but I guess objectively, yes.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts. See.
Should we start on time? Or
I think we start at 10. We can wait a few, maybe just a few.
10:05.
Because you have the full hour and a half, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
We're good.
And so, yes, okay. Let's see what happens.
oh, I'm so sorry.
We misorganize our words. Let's see
what happens.
I guess I'm not organized.
Yeah,
It's
hard.
wonderful.
Hi.
See you again.
There's a good light.
It's one of the rare mornings where this is actually a preferable room because it's so dreary outside and there are no windows for you to sit at.
I never had classes there.
That's what somebody else
Oh,
is.
that's
They
interesting.
have never,
Yeah.
is it just, is it because it's a small classroom?
I don't know. It just yeah, it was mostly in the hallway. You know, like
You didn't go to class, did you?
I did. I went to every law school class, but I didn't go to a lot of undergrad classes. Yeah.
Do you go here for undergrad as well?
No,
Oh.
and I missed half of high school.
Really?
Yeah, cutting was like a way of life.
Just skip, oh, wow.
Just skip out. Just go visit other high schools.
Is it still called cutting? I don't even know. It's
Is
probably
that-
not cutting classes, that's like still the word. I don't know.
I can't keep up.
I use cutting. Missing cutting.
Chris, I walked down to the Luskin Center to just meet someone for breakfast down there.
Oh.
And it was the first time I then got onto the campus, and I could see how it's so incredibly similar to the hilly campus of Cornell.
Yeah,
You
when we
must
went,
have felt
yeah.
exactly at home.
Yeah. Although it's funny, I was just in the law school 95% of the time. You know,
Right, but, oh, I see, so you didn't go down the
Right,
hill,
right.
right, up the hill.
But yeah, you just told me, and the Luskin is, I think, my favorite hotel in the world. That lobby is so beautiful.
Mm.
Like, like just like the
Mhm.
color, the way they did it, I'm like, I feel so at home here.
It's
I don't want
not-
to leave.
It's, what, like 15 years, or, I don't, what was
It's
it?
like 10 years old.
What was there before?
Just like nothing. Maybe a
Okay.
parking lot.
Oh, okay, yeah. The breakfast place was great. Oh, yeah.
How far is the one to your house?
Not bad, like a 12-minute walk.
Oh, okay.
Especially if you're coming from here because you're going downhill.
Right, right. It's like, I guess you could run down the grassy hill, but they have like straight
I'm
down the
walking.
middle.
Only if you're-
three,
only if you're from there.
You know what, who was
Morning.
out? All the dogs. Lots of dogs.
Dog
The
walkers
Dog
or-
walkers, between, it must have been 8 AM, but they have the run of the whole campus,
Oh, yeah.
dogs.
Wow.
It wasn't like that when I was here.
Like
in law
five,
school.
Really?
Yeah.
5, 6 big dogs, and I was like,
Yeah, I
oh,
was
I'm
like,
a little
every
nervous, but like their
house
dog owners were.
Like in Westwood is here with their dog.
Yeah.
like walking through the campus. Yeah.
Right,
Hope they have a bag with them.
and hardly any people.
Yeah. I suspect that's a weekend thing. I would say during the week there are
No dogs?
a similar number of dogs. They're just more people to surround them.
Yeah, I mean, they
I can
acted
agree.
like this was their campus, the dogs. Like the fountain's there,
This
they're
is kind of
like,
like-
they're running down the hill.
This is kind of
Yeah.
like their
The
Central
dogs
Park.
do that during the week too.
But they must love the stuff.
Yeah. I'll take it.
Yes,
They
exactly.
must love all the students though.
I didn't hear any dog.
I remember when I was in law school here, like, John Lithgow would come and talk through.
The actor?
Yeah, the actor,
Yeah.
because his wife was a professor there.
Oh, wow.
So like he would be like jogging through the campus or.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really funny.
Celebrity joggers.
Hey, how you doing? Manny Lawrence.
We're gonna get started in 10 o'clock.
No, I mean, I work in a pocket. Yeah, home and meals. But, I've been coming to these conferences for a long time. I'm went to Pepperdine Law for the MBR program.
Did you get to catch up with your friend from Brooklyn?
Really,
Brooklyn Law?
No, not so
Oh.
much. Yeah, just we always talk.
Okay.
Yeah, we could just get.
In New York City? Yeah. Let me fill this with New York City. She ran into
Did you meet Anna Roberts?
More
She was here for with us maybe 3 years and then went over to Brooklyn. Yeah, but I don't ever see her anymore.
maybe I can do a little preface before, like origin story before we get started at 10:05. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Kwok. I'm the moderator for this panel, but I'll be kind of participating as a panelist too. I don't know. You'll see how it goes and see if that works. But I want to introduce our panelists. We're all from New York City, so it's kind of East Coast. East Coast come here to West Coast to critical race studies, which is sort of my life. But Dr. Phil Lee, professor at St. John's, Dr. Vivian Louie, professor at CUNY Hunter, and Dr. Elaine Chu. Wait, not doctor. Can we call ourselves doctor? Did we ever call ourselves doctor?
No, it's just changing.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Professor Chu from St. John's Law School as well. So good to be here with you. If I could start with a story about myself, this is very meaningful for me to be here with you because when I was an undergrad, I read Kim Crenshaw in Asian American Studies class, and I remember the lines about structural, racism and about how systems are built, but when the racists are gone, the system is still there, and it felt actually like a thunderbolt from the heavens, and I said, where did she teach? And I had to be there. And that's sort of what led me here to law school in 1997. And then a very long journey in between. And a lot of the work, to be very honest with you, that I've done as a community organizer, because I'm not a full-time professor, I'm an adjunct, is around the issues and the things that I learned here, but that I've struggled with, very honestly. And hopefully this will be a conversation that we'll have together, but then with you, for you to come in, because there's a struggle with Asian Americans within the black-white dialectic sort of in America. This is not new to Asian American crit, but it's something that we'll explore here. So I think with that, and thank you for allowing me to share that with you. Maybe we should just get started, right? What do you think? We're going to do two issues that have really roiled Asian America in the last 15 years. The larger one is education. And we're going to speak about Asian Americans and education. But as we get into discussions, we're going to not talk about SFFA, which is a panel we all want to go to too as well. But we're going to speak about the specialized high school admissions in New York City, which is related but different. And I'll explain more as we get in there. And then we'll pivot in the middle to, we're going to spend about half an hour on that, and then the next half hour we're going to talk about anti-Asian hate and the responses of the Asian American community to that and what we did as community advocates. And then the last half hour is left for discussion with you, hopefully. And throughout that, we invite you to be part of that discussion as well. And the thread that runs through it, for us, or for me, is the invisibility of Asian Americans in a lot of those narrative spaces when the discussions are being had in government, in courtrooms, and things like that. So that's the thread that's binding that together. So with that being said, we'll come back and we'll start with Asian Americans in education. We'll have 10-minute presentations from Phil, and then 10 minutes from Vivian. So.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. These remarks come from a law review article draft that I have not placed yet. I plan to place it in the spring, but it's about Asian Americans and selective high school admissions. This is a very small piece of that article. Let me begin with an idea I heard back in 1994 when I was a sophomore in college. Cornel West came to Duke University, and he spoke at Duke Chapel. And he said, people of color are doomed to, the word he used was unfreedom. People of color are doomed to unfreedom unless they can create coalitions with other people of color and see common linkages and historical overlaps. I want to talk about, in that spirit, how Asian Americans and African Americans have been constructed in a discursive space of American racial discourse. I'm a law professor, so my examples will come from law cases. And my focus in my career, my research, the paper I wrote over the past year, is on educational access. But to understand this theme, I draw from other areas of law. I start with not an education law case, but an evidence case called People versus Hall. It's a California Supreme Court case from 1854. This is a case during the California Gold Rush, and there was a white man named George Hall and his brother. They were robbing a Chinese miner. The Chinese miner's colleague, who is also of Chinese descent, heard the commotion, and he runs out to see what's going on. George Hall shoots him dead. Right? George Hall is tried, and he's sentenced to hang by the trial court. Right? But here is the legal issue. There is an evidentiary rule in the state of California that provided, quote, no black or mulatto person or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man. The only witness to this murder was a Chinese man. The question before the court, is this Chinese witness black, mulatto, or Indian? Right? So the court created two categories in this world. Right? I think this is a consistent theme. I've written about this as well. There's essentially white and non-white. And so the Chinese person was relegated to the non-white category. I'll give you some language from the case, which I find important, so I will quote extensively. The anomalous spectacle of a distinct people, they're talking about Chinese people, living in our community, recognizing no laws of the state except through necessity, bringing with them their prejudices and national feuds in which they indulge in open violation of the law, whose mendacity is proverbial, a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior, and who are incapable of progress or intellectual development beyond a certain point, as their history has shown, differing in language, opinions, color, and physical conformation, between whom and ourselves, nature has placed an impassable difference, is now presented, and for them is claimed, not only the right to swear away the life of a citizen, but the further privilege of participating with us in administrating the affairs of our government. I'm a property professor. I've been one for over 10 years. This is what we call, when we teach the rule against perpetuities, a parade of horribles. Another way to call this is a slippery slope. If you give these animals, right, paraphrasing, the right to testify against a white man, next they'll have the right to vote. Next they'll take over society, and society is doomed. Another way to to put a label on this is yellow parallelism. Here are these others taking over and destroying American civilization. People versus Hall assumed that Chinese people living in America were inherently unassimilable. There were real-world effects to this case. It led to violent roundups in which white mobs drove Chinese people out of their communities and even murdered them without fear of Chinese witnesses testifying against the perpetrators. Right? This is documented in Gene Faucher's book, Driven Out. Right? In addition, and most importantly, divided the world into two categories, white and non-white. Right? What does this case have to do with educational access? If you follow the reasoning in the two other cases I talk about next, you'll see the connection, hopefully. I want to take you to 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, U.S. Supreme Court case. Homer Plessy, right? He had the appearance of a white man, but he had one drop of black blood. So according to the laws of Louisiana, he was classified as a black man. He was sitting in the wrong section, right, according to the state law, of the railroad car. Right? Here we have a black man sitting in the white section of the railroad car. He was arrested and he was fined and he was penalized under criminal law. And the question for the court is that a protection, is that a violation of Homer Plessy's equal protection rights? And the court held that no, that is consistent with equal protection. It is separate but equal, right? I have some time, I want to give you a side note. Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, frequently cited by right-wing judges as justification that we should live in a colorblind world, we should have colorblind jurisprudence. Right? Justice Harlan wrote, our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. So if you look at SFA versus Harvard 2023 U.S. Supreme Court case, Chief Justice Roberts ends with that quote. I've counted Justice Thomas in his concurring opinion. He cites that 7 times. 2007 U.S. Supreme Court case parents involved. Justice Thomas, in his concurring opinion, he cites the same language. Right? In fact, he goes even further. He says, this is the same tradition of the civil rights advocates that litigated Brown versus Board of Education, our colorblind Constitution, right? I teach this in my civil rights and my race and the law class. I say, let's take the full dissenting opinion of Harlan, and you just go to the same paragraph, very beginning. What does it say? It says the white race is the dominant race in the society, and in prestige, achievements, education, wealth, and power. and it will continue to be so long as it holds fast to the principles of constitutional liberty, right? And I'll stop there. I say go 3 paragraphs down, and then it talks about the Chinese race. Here's a race that's so different, they could ride the cars. And if they could ride the cars, it makes no sense that black people can't ride the cars, right? So rhetorical questions, think this through. What does it mean when the originator or major architect of colorblindness was a white supremacist, was not colorblind himself, right? That's something to think about. African American, white, Asian American, Latinx, Native American, right? Folks that say, I want to cling to these colorblind principles. Well, I submit, if we take Harlan's example, he wasn't colorblind, no one's colorblind, right? From a CRT perspective, we're all part of it. We are enculturated in a white supremacist society, right? We live in a white supremacist structure, so we're a part of it. The most we could do is acknowledge and resist and push back. Let me go back. Okay. Plessy subsequently justified the legal segregation of white and non-white children in elementary and secondary schools. Right? As a result, non-white students consistently received inferior educational experiences to their white counterparts. The targets of Jim and Jane Crow, right, were not limited to people of African descent. In fact, the segregation had a multiracial dimension. I'll give you my final example, 1927 US Supreme Court case, Lum versus Rice. 9-year-old Chinese American 3rd grader, Martha Lum, wanted to attend the public school that was close to her house, right? But there was a provision in the Mississippi Constitution that said white and black children could not be educated together. So she enrolled, they figured out, hey, there's a Chinese student among us, and they kicked her out. What did the court hold? I give you some language from the case. Most of the cases cited arose, it is true, over the establishment of separate schools as between white pupils and black pupils. We cannot think that the question is any different or that any different result can be reached where the issue is between white pupils and pupils of the yellow races. Do you see the connection between people versus all? There are 2 categories in society. It's white and non-white. What case did Lum cite to? Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The scaffolding, the legal structure is being built case by case. The court was dividing the world between white people and non-white people. Right? Just like it did in People versus Hall, just like it did in schools, and the question of who can attend these schools going forward. Let me, about 1 minute. So why do I highlight this history of racial exclusion that applied to both African Americans and Asian Americans? And if I had more time, if I had more than 10 minutes, I would also talk about educational exclusion that applied to Native Americans. And I'll talk about the boarding schools in America. I talk about Mexican American children in California, Mendez versus Westminster, and other cases. Right? But know that's out there. I want to focus in my limited time to 2 groups. I'll give you some reasons and I'll conclude. I focus on this connection because I believe this history has been erased. Oh, speaking of which, I see Jerry Kang in the audience. I saw a presentation by Professor Kang at Harvard Law School years ago, and he actually mentioned, and this actually stayed with me for years and years and years, he mentioned that he's taught civil rights for a long time, and that language that Harlan uses was redacted for years. So all you could see in constitutional law casebooks is our Constitution is colorblind, star, star, star. Right? Everything else is redacted. And so imagine that, generations of law students, future judges, legal scholars, with the idea that this colorblind Constitution was actually written by someone who was colorblind. And think of the power, the knowledge, the reification, how that creates reality going forward. Right? So I talk about this history because I think it's been erased. I teach race in the law, I teach civil rights and civil liberties. Most of my students are 3rd-year law students. I taught at a historically black institution for 10 years before I taught at St. John's, and I poll my students, have you heard of People versus Hall? Have you heard of Lum v. Rice? Have you heard of Chinese exclusion? And almost always the answer is no, never heard of these things. Right? Here's something to imagine. What could coalition and racial understanding look like if lots and lots of people understood these connections? Right. A couple more points. I like to keep track of my
This clock runs differently from yours.
It's to So another reason is to show that Asian Americans and African Americans have a common interest in educational inclusion based on a history of racialized exclusion. Right? 2 more points. It's to create a world in which Asian Americans see issues like African Americans absent in their educational spaces, right? And issues like mass incarceration and issues like combating various forms of virulent anti-blackness as their own issues as well. Right? Final point, it's also to see a world in which African Americans see that issues like anti-Asian violence and racist immigration policies and construction of Asian Americans as the perpetual foreigner as their issues as well. Right? My conclusion, making historical connections and contextual overlap is a pivotal first step in all of these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. If I could just take 2 minutes before we get to Vivian, which is that thread for people versus Hall of Invisibility, for me, it really starts in American law. You know, the statute was written, I think, right before California entered the Union. They're like, we just got to make sure Native Americans, mulattoes, their term for the Spanish, and blacks don't have coverage of the law, and that was the statute. That was named in the statute, and it was extended by interpretation to the Chinese once they came in large numbers through interpretation. The actual prosecution of Hall, because it was overturned, was actually a federal prosecution. They actually spent a lot of money and time to prosecute the people that killed the Chinese gold miners. So that's an interesting point, that there's this, that it's not like they didn't know. They're like, no, you can't just go around killing people, even though it's the West, you know, like, but, you know, let's prosecute them. So they were gonna hang. And they went to the California Supreme Court where this was overturned, and they extended to the Chinese. And I think that, and then other Asians. So I think that invisibility thread, which is gonna be present, at least in my argument, through both of these issues, starts in American law, even though it comes off the books at some point. But that thread, that very disturbing thread, where the law is not for you, right, is sort of what I locate there. And we'll return to it. Thank you. So, Vivian.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having this conference, and thank you for having me. I want to thank my panelists for having me. I'm not trained. I'm not a lawyer, so bear with me. I'm trained as a sociologist, and I am currently a professor in urban policy and planning at Hunter College. So I'm very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary type of person. My remarks are going to build on what Phil, and Phil's also an old student of mine, so it's very special to me. All his success is his, of course. I just taught him one class. So it's very special. So what I'm going to do is build on what he shared so insightfully about discursive spaces around education and race, right? I'm going to discuss the crucial role of place-based policies, both non-educational policies and educational ones, that really transform New York City's opportunity structure. Whites are, of course, a key part of this story, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to address them in a lot of depth. I can certainly do that later on. But I want us to be aware that they're also key actors. So the story I'm going to tell is about race, and it's about class, right? The broader focus of this story are low-income and poor Black and Latino students. We all know this in this room, but more people should know this, right? That low-income and poor Black and Latino students, they typically attend under-resourced, struggling public K-12 schools. That's the story in our nation. That's the story certainly in New York City. These public schools are typically located in poor neighborhoods. They have less prepared teachers. They have students who are mostly Black, Latino, and poor. These are the facts, right? So I want to bring the facts into the story. And how these facts inform the social context and practical realities that people live in their everyday lives. I want us to get to that level. So I want to say that this is also about my larger argument in my work, that racialized patterns of inequality are rooted in policies and in laws, right? Some are easier to kind of spot than others, all right? So these are the students and the families and schools who need the most institutional resources, and they've had the least, right? So when I say this, I want to acknowledge, of course, there are middle, upper middle, wealthy Blacks and Latinos in our nation and in New York City, but they're not the focus of my remarks today. So I want to bring into the picture historical context, right? I want to bring us back to the 1970s, which was really influential in our nation, in our world, and in central cities across our nation. We were fighting a war against Vietnam, 1965, 1973. Wars are expensive, so our federal leaders decided to pay for that war by cutting anti-poverty policies. The nation was still recovering from the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy. Then it was rocked by the assassinations of civil rights leaders Malcolm X, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr., 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, that same year, 1968. There was poverty, there was despair in Black central city neighborhoods. We then had a national recession from 73, 75, high unemployment, inflation. As per usual, and if some of this story is resonating with you about today, you're not the only one. But hopefully we can write a better story, a better outcome. But as per usual, during an economic upheaval like that, Black Americans are hit the hardest, they're hit the earliest, they suffer the longest. Getting back to New York City, 74, New York City has a debt of $13.5 billion due to fiscal mismanagement. The state bails out the city, but the price is they take over financial oversight until 1986. Mass layoffs amongst city workers, widespread cutbacks in services. I was born and raised in New York City, so I remember those times. It's documented, it's a fact, that city officials decided to disinvest in Black working class neighborhoods. Their strategy was to propel Blacks to leave the city. It didn't work. Most Blacks had to stay in the city despite having to live in increasingly poor conditions, including poor public neighborhood schools. They couldn't afford to move out. You have our nation's shift from a manufacturing economy to a service economy that emphasizes a college degree. You get an economic division in the Black American population. Black Americans with college and advanced degrees, they can finally get high-paying jobs, they can move out into integrated neighborhoods. But Black Americans without a college degree, they can't, right? They continue to be stuck. So you see these central city neighborhoods, high rates of unemployment for men, rise in households headed by women, intense poverty, the crack epidemic, tougher drug laws, mass incarceration. I mean, we heard bits and pieces of this in the last few days, important pieces, of course. I'm telescoping a lot of history here, and I want to say that there were certainly strong family bonds, there was uplift, there was love, there was success in these communities. Still, this is a story of struggle, of isolation, okay? And then we have a mayor, Michael Bloomberg, led New York City from 2001 to 2013. He knew what was going on, and he decided to institute school reform through a complex choice model. In theory, what that choice model would do would allow low-income and poor Black and Latino families to exercise choice, to bypass their failing neighborhood public schools. But they didn't, that's not the outcome, right? Who benefited from a choice system? It was well-to-do white parents. They had the information to navigate a very complex system, and let me tell you, it is very complex, having navigated it. Again, poor and Black Latino families are stuck, right? According to a 2012 Schott Foundation report, students in 6 of the city's 32 community school districts, all in Harlem, all in Bronx and the Brooklyn, mostly Black and Latino students from poor families, they had no access to high-performing schools. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the reports that had been, including the UCLA Civil Rights Project, right? Their reports. I do want to turn to the transformation of Asian immigrant New York City. The years since 1968, what it's done is it's transformed those neighborhoods. It's brought in global wealth, ethnic resources, alongside poverty, alongside new inequalities and social problems. And that economic difference is also key, because Asian Americans had the city's highest poverty rate for 9 years, from 2005 to 2017, as defined by the city's own standards. But most people don't know that fact. So if we look at the Chinese case, and I picked the Chinese case because they are still the city's largest Asian ethnic group. They've had a presence in New York City both pre-65, post-65. I want to talk about the Immigration Act of 1965, but didn't get to talk about that too much, so I'm just going to bring it into the story. Of course, that has been crucial, right? And who pushed for that? It was Black civil rights activists who pushed for that, right? And that's a basic fact that we should all know. I'm sure we all know it here, but I would wager, and I'm not a betting woman, but I would wager that most people at UCLA, whether they're faculty or staff or students, don't know that fact. So let's get it out there, right? And that the civil rights movement transformed the America that these new immigrants were entering. I mean, that's also a fact. So to bring us back to New York City, to the Chinese immigrant communities, as late as the early 1940s, Manhattan's Chinatown was still a small area of mainly male, working-class Chinese immigrants from southern China, in an insular place designed for survival. And that was the same for Chinatowns across the nation. People built Chinatowns, right, because they wanted protection against violence against them. So yesterday was actually the 151st anniversary of the Los Angeles massacre of Chinese immigrants in 1871. Okay, I just want to note that, all right? So these men were separated from their wives because it was against the law. They couldn't bring their wives into the US. And so what that immigration reform did was it finally ended nearly a century of virtual exclusion of Asians. I'm going to go over of Asians from entering the US, right? And you get working class and you get middle class immigrants. So New York City's Chinatown expands, but there's the rise of other Asian ethnic communities. I'm going to go over by a minute or two because I want to really get into the other policies that transform these communities. It's not like anybody just moves here and then everything is whatever, right? Policies matter, laws matter. So again, bringing us back to the 1970s, the federal government reduces funding to states and cities. So, but these places still need money to pay their bills, right? So state and local officials, what do across the nation? They turn to global investors. Global investors from Canada, from Europe, the Middle East, Asia. Global investors need a place to park their money. So in the case of Chinese immigrant economies in the US, the global investors are from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, right, Singapore. You also get a small set of affluent Chinese American investors who have the money to invest in these areas. You get zoning laws, right, that actually make it possible for these investments to build these areas. And it ramps up gentrification, okay? So what do you have there? You have, again, the wealth and the poor and the low income. You have low income folks who are working in these communities who get pushed out. It's still happening today, right? Who get pushed out because they can't afford to live in those communities anymore. It's too expensive, all right? You get labor exploitation. You get Chinese immigrant bosses exploiting their workers. Is this because they have some cultural thing that makes them want to exploit their workers? No, it's not. It's because the US government has weak labor laws, and the labor unions were weak at that time. It was an opportunity, right? But you also get institutions that emerge to serve these folks. You get cross-class institutional building, and that is hugely important. So Min Jo, who is a distinguished professor here at UCLA, Jan Lin, who's a sociologist at Occidental, they've written a lot about that in New York City and in LA, right? So through those linkages, key information about the educational system, remember in New York City, very complex, gets exchanged. You get the rise of a private test prep center, right, industry. Immigrant owned, immigrant run, immigrant served for working class people. And this is just the last thing I'm gonna leave you with, because I know I'm more than at time. That test prep industry, where does it come from? It comes from federal accountability mandates. It comes from No Child Left Behind, passed in 2002, prioritizing standardized testing. NCLB made test prep incredibly common across our nation for Americans across different backgrounds. So it's this mix of global, federal, national, and local policies that are creating the context in which people are living their everyday lives and shaping their opportunities. And I'm just gonna end with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to just take some time just to sort of tie those strands together, if I could. So just for those of you that don't have junior high school students in New York City, New York City public schools, 1 million students, largest district in the country, 1 million students, right? And about 300,000 high school students. That's how big the population is. The charter school movement, by the way, has about 10% of all those students. So we've got like more than 120,000 students outside of the New York City public schools and charter schools. But how do you get into a high school? After the school reform movements that Vivian noted, there's programs, there's things you can apply to. It's not really exactly geographical, but it's like multi-factor. That's generally how you get into a high school in New York. You apply as a junior high schooler. And then there's a certain subset, they're called specialized science and math schools, that traditionally, for more than 100 years, have had an exam, because they began as math and science schools, and so they had an exam. And the big three are Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. And for a long time, they have been thought of as like the elite schools. And so that is where the fight has been located within New York City. If you took the total population of all the specialized high school admissions exam schools, the Shazat, it's about 5% of all the high school students in New York City. So the fight is actually about a very specific type. And until the 60s and 70s, those schools were heavily immigrant and heavily Jewish. They were like over close to 50% Jewish for much of their lives. And then beginning in that demographic change that Vivian noted in the 60s and the 70s, in which period there were not huge, but sizable Black and Latino populations in those schools, anywhere from 3 to 7%. And then for Brooklyn Tech, 50% up into the 90s, depending on the school. Because you would score, and then depending on how high you scored, you get into one of the 3 schools that you listed, like 1, 2, 3. When the Asian immigration post-65 started to ramp up, they brought not only that test prep model to the neighborhoods and the schools, they were prepping for the exam in a way that really had not been a practice up until that point. And that really changed it as well. I write about it in my paper called The Inscrutable Shazat, if anyone wants to look that up. And at the same time that the Asian migration to New York ramps up, the Black and Latino population at those schools fall. They just go across like that. And for Asian immigrant populations, it's the only school that matters, in a really sort of parallel way to talk about sort of how Asian Americans see Ivy League schools and that sort of thirst for prestige. And that's happening at the New York City level. So there's a lot of similarities, but differences with SSFA and things like that. But that's the thread that we have here. And beginning with de Blasio, who comes in right after Bloomberg, de Blasio is really, in many ways, he's of that progressive left. He became sort of the mayor from out of nowhere when he ran an ad with his son who was biracial. you know, and people are like, oh, he's cool, you know, he's down with it, he understands, we had enough of Bloomberg, right? And he comes in and he's like, we gotta change the schools. We gotta do something about the schools. And in the second term, he delays it to a second term. He makes that change, and he doesn't do it, doesn't talk to the Asian American community. He makes a huge announcement, and the Asian American community in New York goes crazy, and protests in the streets, and is complaining about what he's doing. So maybe I'll just leave it there right now, because we'll pick up the thread. But I just wanted to set that and tie that together, and you know, so.
Can I just add one more fact in terms of the context, and then we can talk about it later. You know, if you look at the specialized high schools in New York City, the percentage of black and brown students is 10%. If you look at the percentage of public school students in the New York City public school system, 70%.
Yep.
70%. So that's the context. Like, we talk more about that, but just wanna put that on the table.
And then the other number that's really important is that in K through 6, whites are like 10, 20%, 30%, and then by middle school and high school, they're just dropping off a cliff. So by the time they get to high school, whites are like less than 10% of all the New York City students. They have essentially exited the system by the time they get to high school. They have either gone to the suburbs, gone to Catholic schools, gone to charter schools, gone to private schools. So they think like really by the time like, you know, education gets serious, you know, like, you know, if you have a kid, right, they're exited the public school system in large numbers by high school. Any other thoughts about that before we go to Elaine? Okay. All right, pivot.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Elaine Chu, and I'm thrilled to be here today to talk with you about space, race, and the law. I want to start my presentation with a riddle. What? It's not that clever. What do a synagogue, a black church, and a gay bar have in common? The answer's pretty simple. These spaces are the spaces that we as Americans understand as the locales of quintessential hate crimes. And as it turns out, this list is a rather short list of 3 spaces. My presentation is going to proceed in 2 parts. First, I'm going to start with a pretty short primer on the special concern that we sometimes see in our criminal laws about physical spaces. And then second, I'm going to follow that with an analysis of several attacks that occurred on Asian Americans during the pandemic. These were attacks that happened in what I call yellow spaces. So, the first part. It turns out that there's a very long-standing tradition in American criminal laws to focus in on special physical spaces. Many states and the federal government, for instance, have crimes whose very definitions require that you prove that a drug sale or that drug possession with intent to sell occurs either at a school or within 1,000 feet of a school. Why do we have these crimes? Well, clearly we and legislatures have a heightened concern for the occupants of these physical spaces called schools, and of course that's students and children, and their vulnerability to activities like the purchase and sale of addictive narcotics. A second example is that there are numerous crimes that protect houses of worship. If you choose to burglarize a church or if you burn down a temple, you'll face a far higher sentence than if you vandalize another non-worshiping space. These spaces are of heightened concern because of the very activities that are done inside these spaces, the practice of religion. So how do we go from what is a pretty strong tradition in the criminal laws of paying attention to special physical spaces to hate crimes? What we have to do is just switch our thinking and switch from asking why the state might have an interest in certain spaces to thinking about why perpetrators might have an interest in certain spaces. In the 1990s, there was a horrific spate of black church burnings. Within a span of about 18 months, more than 30 black churches were destroyed across the South in the United States. Now, many recognize that these burnings in the 1990s were not isolated acts of violence, but instead were a part of a very long history of racial intimidation and violence in America directed at black churches. This time, though, what was interesting about the ones in the 1990s was that Congress realized that federal criminal laws could do more than they were doing to reflect this connection between space and racialized hate. That spaces can serve as evidence of a racialized hate and animus of the perpetrators towards the occupants of those spaces. So, in other words, these arsonists may have been motivated maybe by a hatred toward the exercise of religion, but also, or maybe even instead, they were really motivated by the race or color or ethnicity of the members of these houses of worship. So Congress kind of puts this together, and this is notable that in 1996, they pass amendments to the federal general arson statute, and they define a new type of arson offense. Whoever intentionally defaces, damages, or destroys any religious real property because of the race, color, or ethnic characteristics of any individual associated with that religious property, they shall be punished. Like the traditional criminal laws that I had mentioned earlier, prosecutors under this federal law again have to prove the element of a specific location. But they now must also prove a motive element, and a motive element that draws on the association of these spaces with people of particular races, color, or ethnicity. I consider this 1996 federal statute a hate crime statute, but it is rare among hate crime statutes because it's concerned with a particular space, namely religious properties. The overwhelming majority of hate crime statutes are not. They don't name any special spaces. Instead, what they are characteristically defined by is that requirement of that motive element that perpetrators select, target victims, or commit crimes because of a protected demographic like race or ethnicity. Back to my riddle. Black church, synagogue, gay bar. As I said, these are special spaces that Americans, including the police, prosecutors, juries, they have developed a muscle memory around them. And from the first moment that an assault or an act of property destruction is reported at these locations, onlookers, eyewitnesses, responding officers, they immediately, everybody characterizes these assaults as possible hate crimes, simply based on the locale. They are, of course, some assaults at gay bars, some arsons of temples and mosques that are not hate crimes. But that label and immediate understanding that they're possible hate crimes means much more investigation will be done, many more particular types of questions will be asked, hopefully answered, right? Because what we're going to be doing then is really searching for whether or not there is that racialized bias. So one of the papers that I'm working on is trying to get us into a more constant and consistent habit of asking, can a space tell us something about the motives of perpetrators? And so that's one paper, but for the second half of my presentation today, what I want to talk about is really a discussion of yellow spaces. So to provide a working definition for us, yellow spaces are spaces where one typically finds a lot of people who belong in the AAPI, NH racial category. What are examples of yellow spaces? Well, if you wanted to go somewhere where you could count on, in America, seeing lots of Asian Americans, or maybe even only Asian Americans, like where would you go? On this list certainly would be the many Filipino towns, Korea towns, Chinatowns, Little India, Little Pakistan, Little Saigons, right? Neighborhoods. But in addition to those neighborhoods, let's think about places that are not neighborhoods. Where would you go to find, a high probability of, again, lots of Asian Americans? Where would you go? You would go to a nail salon. You would go to a massage parlor. You would go to a boba tea store. Got lots of those. You'd go to a Chinese takeout restaurant. You would go to casinos. It's true, right? Easily, I think we can put together a pretty robust list of yellow spaces, but yet consider that not one of these yellow spaces are on this very short list of quintessential locales for American hate crimes. So what happens when assaults and crimes committed against Asian Americans are being done in these yellow spaces? How are they understood by onlookers, by responding police officers? Are they treated as possible hate crimes based simply on the fact of their locale? The rash of violence during COVID was a rude awakening for many Americans, including Asian Americans. Although it was not the first time that this country had seen virulent violence against Asian Americans, the pandemic shook up what had otherwise been kind of a long period of few and isolated attacks. So beginning in 2020, there was this explosion of violent assaults across the country, including New York City, and this explosion offered us a chance to push beyond the attacks in gay bars and black churches, and a chance to account for the Asian American experience of mass racialized violence. I'm going to very quickly describe 3 particular times in which Asian Americans were killed in yellow spaces during the pandemic. And each one of these, I think, reflects a different lesson and opportunity to think about how we need to grow beyond the familiar tropes. The first is an example, I think, of how a narrowly conceived notion of space, right, can lead to under-policing and maybe then enable a tragic killing. On April 30th, 2022, there was a 45-year-old man named Ziwen Yang. He was riding his scooter making deliveries for a Chinese takeout restaurant in Queens when Glenn Hirsch shot him dead. It turns out that Glenn Hirsch had been a repeat customer at the takeout restaurant where Mr. Yang worked, but Glenn had had a running argument with this restaurant for months. Supposedly, one of the things that they fought about was duck sauce and inadequate quantities of duck sauce, right? During these arguments, the owner of the restaurant later tells media that Mr. Hirsch would repeatedly threaten to return to the store and to shoot them all with a gun, and that the police knew about these threats, but they never did a damn thing about these threats. Was that because the police ignored the fact that takeout restaurants like this one are yellow spaces? Employing, as this one did, people of Asian descent? When these threats were phoned in, did the police categorize them or investigate them or prioritize them as possible hate crimes? Likely not. Because after all, takeout restaurants are not the usual spaces where hate crimes occur, at least not in our imagination. If the police had listened more closely to the signals from this yellow space, could they have intervened with this angry customer? Could they have prevented the death of this Asian New Yorker? Second story. It's from around here, I think an hour east of here. On January 21st, 2023, the largest mass shooting in the history of Los Angeles County occurred in Monterey Park. The night that it happened was a celebration of the Lunar New Year, and that was when Kang opened fire 42 times in a crowded social club called the Star Ballroom and killed 11 people and seriously injured 9 others. Was this a hate crime? The gunman was not caught right away, but from the get-go, media coverage about this horrific massacre cast the attack as a possible hate crime. Given the predominantly Asian clientele of the social club and the cultural salience of the Lunar New Year holiday. The second story then is a contrasting example to the first, when Americans and media were willing to be more expansive with their conceptions of where hate crimes happen and who the victims of hate crime are. Perhaps by January of 2023, the constant news reports, the rallies, the protests, the advocacy efforts had primed us all to pay close attention to the fact that the Star Ballroom was indeed a yellow space, and that there was a thing known as anti-Asian hate, and a hate that could drive us to even, shootings. Final instance is perhaps the most memorable for Asian Americans when we think back to these dark days of the pandemic, and that is the Atlanta spa shootings that occurred in March of 2021. Asian Americans came out in droves to march in solidarity and to grieve the murder of 8 people by Robert Aaron Long. And if you ask any of them, any of my students, any of my friends and family, many of them would say that absolutely these attacks were hate crimes. But were they? This third case presents a really interesting question about space and the evidence of motive. Soon, I think before year end, the plan is that there will be a trial in Fulton County. This is 4.5 years later. A trial in Fulton County. Can the office of DA Fannie Willis prove that this defendant intentionally selected his victims, right, because of their actual perceived race? Employed at these massage parlors were women of Asian descent. In fact, 6 of the 8 people he killed that day were Asian American women. Does the fact that they worked in a yellow space tell us anything about why he decided to go and shoot up these people? Now, in this instance, the police did pay attention to that, and they did from the beginning investigate for a bias motive. And according to media reports, Robert Aronlaw denied that race had anything to do with why he went where he went to shoot and kill people. Instead, he explained that he suffered from a sex addiction, and that as a customer at these places, he targeted these locations because they fueled this sex addiction he had. The question about motive in this prosecution is complicated. Given the long-standing fetishization of Asian women as compliant, eager to please sex objects, was the race of the victims an inextricable part of the killer's admitted motive to eliminate sexual temptation? If the stereotype cannot be separated from the killer's motive, then aren't these killings because of their race? Aren't they hate crimes? It's going to be really interesting, I think, to see how a jury in Georgia will receive these arguments. To conclude, you can understand my presentation in two ways. You could hear it as a call to expand the prosecution of hate crimes by relying on space as evidence of motive more readily than we do. But I'll be the first to admit that for the last 2 days, talking about this moment of Trump 2.0, the call for more government prosecutions to punish racists makes absolutely no sense, when in so many ways our own federal government is committing its own race-based horrors. So I will concede that. The second way, though, that you can understand my presentation is as a call, as Chris and others here have reminded us, to make visible and to insist again and again upon the inclusion of the lived experiences of Asian Americans as part of a bigger project of race consciousness and a quest for equality and justice. What was happening in the yellow spaces of America and in our Asian American communities in the times of the pandemic should not be forgotten. There's a troubling reality there of hate and violence, and a troubling reality of a gap, I think, in our imagination and our conception around hate crimes, and our failures to account right for those gaps and to do something about those gaps is an exclusionary and unnecessarily costly choice we don't have to make. This choice leaves some Asian Americans like Ziwen Yang, the delivery worker, or maybe even the women who worked in the Atlanta spas, unrecognized as victims of hate crimes and unrecognized victims of racialized violence. Thank you.
If I could sort of make, respond in 2 big buckets. The first one is about praxis. And, Elaine and I were very fortunate to work together during anti-Asian hate through the Anti-Asian Violence Task Force, which was a project of the Asian American Bar Association of New York. So, Elaine, I think you had that year off, and so it was like, okay, I'll do that with my, instead of having fun or doing some other academic work, you were like, let's roll up our sleeves and do this. And then there were so many members of the community that wanted to do something, right? Everyone wanted to do something. What can we do? We as lawyers, we met like every week for more than 2 years, still meets on those issues. So, and people would come to the Asian American Bar, they would be attacked, they would either be verbally harassed or they would have drinks thrown on them, all the way up to more serious physical violence. And that really was where that theory met work. Because when we were doing that work and we were spending a lot of time talking to the police, we were spending a lot of time talking to the district attorneys, what we also found and encountered was that a lot of the Asian Americans in that same space were saying, we can't talk to the police, just defund the police, don't do that. And so we were caught in this very interesting space at that time. We were like, well, we think we want the law to apply to them. What about Vincent Chen and kind of all those hate laws, hate crimes, and those kind of organizing moments and principles? Aren't we doing the same thing? I'm thinking about People versus Hall. I'm like, I don't want to be invisible, under this time. And so we were dealing with that conflict within the Asian American community, just to be, sort of very explicit. And one of the things that we did was also come up with reforms to the Hate Crimes Act, hate crime laws in New York State. And we were able to, and Elaine, sort of, led that, and we were able to get some of those passed. But that was really disavowed by Asian American, we call them progressives. We consider ourselves in that same space, but that was not welcome, within that discussion. And the other thing is to go back to the thread of invisibility. You know, we often talk about, if we talk about it, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but actually the Page Act of 1875 preceded that, and it's actually there we should begin. And what that did was disallow Asian women from coming with the Asian migrants at the time. And that, once again, recurs the theme of invisibility. Because what it does is, I think number one is it overly sexualizes Asian women, because it's like, well, if they're coming, they're prostitutes. That's, to me, I think the beginning of that idea in the American mind. But then the second idea was that the Asian men could not have families. And so there's a erasure, invisibility thread, once again, beginning with the Page Act. And if we bring it back to the Atlanta spa shootings, you know, one of the spas, and I saw this in the documentary about the Atlanta spa shootings, one of the spas is next to a strip club. And so, a strip club is not thought of as like, this is where Asian women are, right? It's like maybe women of all types, right? Whereas Asian spas, like, that's the idea. So he's making, the killer was making very explicit choices when he's like, pulling up. He's like, okay, that's sexual, right? But that's not thought of, because he's thinking Asian women in that spa, that's where I'm gonna find them, right? Because that's his sex addiction. And if you actually look at the police response that day, I don't know if any of you recall the police response that day when they went to the podium to talk about the killer. They were like, he just had a bad day.
That's right.
He had a bad day.
That's right.
And I remember I was like, holy cow. Like, and that was not only verbal, that's actually in their press release. Like, so the immediate identification of law enforcement with the alleged, sort of killer is like so explicit. But I just wanted to make sure that historical moment wasn't lost. And I think once again, it ties back to the invisibility about who is seen and whose concerns are seen. Actually, in the investigation of that day, actually, it's the killer. Like, no, he had a bad day. They had to take it out. Sorry, guys. So that is, I think, elements of that thread that we're seeing of invisibility and of who has that sympathy. So I think with that, I think at this point, we're going to sort of tie that together, because while we were advocating with the district attorney, we helped. We then, out of our advocacy, helped the Alvin Bragg, run for the DA, because we were not, of course, we wanted to be on the side of justice. We didn't want to, contribute to the over-prosecution of African Americans, Latinos, but we wanted to have these hate crimes be prosecuted and individuals feel legitimated by that system to at least acknowledge that that they were experiencing these things, and that it meant a lot to them if the system acknowledged that. And that was part of it, and that was a whole other thing about political participation. But maybe I'll turn it back to my panelists, and then we'll turn it over to you guys to have a discussion, because I think we don't have the answers except to tell you this is where we are, this is what we encountered, this is what we tried to do, and we think we were doing progress, but what can we do better? So I'm going to put my panelists.
I'm still dying. I needed to get through my presentation before I can even start thinking about what they were sharing with us. But one of the things I will note is that on top of what Chris shared with you about our kind of years of work within the New York communities, that I think is kind of interesting is that the race piece of this crisis that we had was unifying for a little while. And so it unified different classes of Asian New Yorkers and Asian Americans. It didn't matter if you had money or not, right? Or how you dressed or not. What mattered often was just like your face or what language you might have been speaking or the color of your hair. And where you were. And where you were you on the right in the neighborhoods? Were you, like easily identifiable targets then? The other thing I think that it unified for some time was a little bit of, well, I would say the politics. There was definitely folks who definitely were going to reject any kind of, resort to the criminal legal system. Like, didn't matter. No, we're going to help these victims some other way. And they did try, I think, to address some of the interests and needs of victims and survivors in other ways, and they were critical to that. But But I would say that it definitely did, for those who were kind of more centered or moderated, and people on the right, I think, were definitely, because like again, you were targeted no matter what your political persuasion was, right? You were simply targeted because of the skin of your face. And so, but it was very brief, and I think I had to go back to kind of teaching and writing because I had to, my leave was over, but also I was royally frustrated by working with politicians and with the infighting that was just so, and still is so true in at least the Asian New York communities, I suspect here as well, so.
I'll give you guys a little sort of the inside view of what we did. Once we helped Alvin Bragg get, elected, I was on his transition committee, and then I was on the hate crimes committee. We had all these recommendations that we did, which he, in his first year, put them all in. He did them all, and of course he's an African-American progressive, sort of, if you know that, the DAs in New York served for 500 years, like you can only leave, you leave when you're 100, but, so the fact that we had a chance to re-elect someone, an African-American progressive, someone who heard our concerns, it was great. And we got all these things into the Manhattan DA's office, which is like the centerpiece of New York City. Each borough has its own DA. We got Mandarin-speaking investigators. We got Mandarin support services. All these things. But I'll tell you also that we lost all of that. They all left within like a year or two because of the really. And it's not about. I think it was just about power inside a very powerful machine in the district attorney's office that went even beyond Alvin Bragg. Sort of we got all those victories, and then that we thought were victories, and then within a year and a half, 2 years, everyone was gone. And it was really interesting. So it was about the accretion of political power, and when it's in the media, when it was, because it was really big in the media for like 2 years, right, or a year and a half. We got every phone call returned, we got every politician hand. And then you're like, wow, this is it, we made it. We're part of that sort of discussion, right? Highly visible, but it gets in and then it just gets spit out. And so I think one of the things that we learned was you get power, you get things, how do you keep it? How do you make it? And then the other part, in the first year of anti-Asian hate, I was like on being interviewed by media, like it felt like every day, like once a week for like 6 or 9 months. And one of the things in my mind was, because it was slowly building up, it was like, hey, look, don't make this an anti-black thing, okay? Like, get on the news, and they're going to ask you who's attacking them. And I'm like, I'm not going to contribute to this because I went to UCLA. I was a critical race studies guy. I get it. I'm trying to advocate for Asian Americans, and I'm not going to contribute to this, right? That's really actually important, right? But who was attacking Asians? Black people, white people, everybody was attacking. I was kind of making the point. Don't ask me that it's just blacks, because people are kind of circling around that question, things you're like,
and they weren't just circling, because we didn't have fluency or literacy on our team, but I knew that we were watching media reports that were strictly in English, and so, but there's a very vibrant, world of digital as well as old-fashioned kind of paper news that's in other languages, and they weren't circling. Okay. They were just right there.
I was on PBS or things like that, and these are very but they wouldn't explicitly ask it, but it was there, and it was a really interesting walk the tightrope, because they're like, no, I don't want to do that because I don't believe that. That's number one, and number two, I'm not going to reinforce that. But then outside of that narrative, when you see the local news every night, even without being explicit, you can see that image that the black suspects are played relentlessly on the video here, whereas white assailants, which there were plenty, they just didn't have that same. You didn't see the perp walk, and it was really fascinating to me just to kind of experience that and see it. But I'll tell you this, is that in the middle of it, the African American community, I think, recognized that some of the attackers were African American, and Al Sharpton came to Chinatown. He had his rally, and I was watching because it was really interesting. He was like, look, out of all the groups, African Americans should be doing this. He was talking to his own community, and I was like, oh, okay, thank you, Al. He's in Chinatown. He's like, I'm coming there. And then Spike Lee, I went on. He asked me to come in for an interview for this documentary he was working, and I was like, oh, I was like, African American leaders are recognizing that. The artists are making that. They're putting that in. They're kind of speaking to it. But then in the larger culture, I think what it really became wedded to was, well, it's a black on Asian thing. That's what it's really about. You know, and I was like, oh, that's something we tried to fight against. But it was so powerful that I think in many ways it became the explanation within Asian American communities, unfortunately. Even though we weren't trying to do that at all, and we're trying to work against it, and try to have these laws apply, but we were caught in the middle of that, so.
Can I chime in quickly?
Yes.
Have a bigger conversation. These connections are actually all over the place if you look for them. I'll give you an example. Frederick Douglass, he gave speeches where he advocated for Asian inclusion into this country, saying that it was an expression of racism to exclude Asian people based on race. Yuri Kochiyama, she was militantly advocating for black power and social justice in this country. When I was at Duke University, I was there at a good time. She came and spoke, and I met her personally. And she said, "Call me Sister Yuri." And I didn't know who she was at the time. I had a Malcolm X t-shirt on, and she had a notepad, and she was like, oh, writing down a quote. And I was like, oh, this is Malcolm X, and he was this civil rights leader. She was so gracious. She said, oh, that's great to know. She was personal friends with Malcolm X. They exchanged correspondence. They had this she designed the t-shirt. I was such an idiot. But that actually is not an indictment on me. It's society. People just don't know these connections. Another story I can think of in terms of the media pitting Asian Americans against African Americans in a personal story. My family and I marched in a Black Lives Matter march on the National Mall. It was me, my wife, and my 3 children. And we had signs advocating for Black Lives Matter. The reporters made a beeline to us, one of the few Asian Americans in the crowd, and they were asking us questions like, don't you feel like you're in danger being amongst these people? And it wasn't very subtle. And then my wife and I were like, this is ridiculous. And so I was making comments like, this is the safest I felt in DC in my entire time. People are giving me water, people are hugging us, they're not kind to my children. And none of that made it into the story, these major mainstream outlets. So they love it when people of color, they could find comments and folks willing to be interviewed, and they kick each other down. But where is the coverage? Where is the emphasis when people are saying, these are my people, right? We march together because we care deeply about these issues. Maybe one more thing. This is a surreal moment for me. I just attended all these wonderful panels, and if you listen closely about the content, so we all have specific work we do, but we're in a context, this surreal moment where people are talking on panels, hey, wouldn't it be nice if the federal government followed basic principles of law? Federalism, separation of powers, stare decisis. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if they weren't explicitly racist and they just didn't care? I'm like, it's so hard to keep on keeping on when the fabric of American democracy and rule of law is in such a crisis mode, right? And so maybe it's something we could talk about, but I'll tell you, that's what I'm struggling with right now. I go to these other panels and there's this complete destabilization. Right.
Well, just to build on that, and certainly, I taught in a school of education, that's where Phil and I met. And education is critical, right? And I think that Kimberly Crenshaw and other folks were saying over the past few days that there's a reason why there's all this hubbub, right, about education, K through 12 education, higher education, of course. It's because these facts, right, there's a desire not to have this history be taught. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to acknowledge as well. I'm also thinking, I think it was Sandy Hudson in the closing plenary yesterday, our own privilege, right? It's not enough that the people in this room, and I'm one of those people, know this. It's not enough that maybe a few people close to us know this, and I grant you, in our extended families, we also have people who, well, anywho, right, might not agree with us, and that's fine, okay? But it's important to make sure that that history into contemporary times is actually taught and learned, and including to people, immigrants and non-immigrants who are well past the age of going to formal schooling, but they're lifelong learners still, right? So how do we get this information, these facts, these histories, these studies, right, out there so that they can understand? And then they can make their own informed judgment. I'm cool with that, right? But if they don't have the facts, then how is that judgment going to be made? And I think that's really, really important. That's how you have a divide and conquer. That's how divide and conquer becomes successful.
And that's really Kim Crenshaw's, that, you know, that fight she's leading, that point of that edge about like banned books, because it's about the banning of that idea, right? The banning of the learning of that history. And you know, when I teach like People versus Hall or Gong versus Lum, you know, and your students learn it for the first time, and I think often they're like, oh my God, I didn't know, and I'm really upset. And I think that we can't leave it there because that's not enough, right? The first thing is for them to know that, but then I think the other thing that we're doing, Vivian, and we've been working on K through 12 Asian American Studies, and that's really real important because we have to take that sort of like, oh, people like me face this discrimination, but then we need to contextualize it. And we need to put it into those like larger historical trends so that they can make an informed decision about where they want to be in that fight. And I think, you know, that K through 12 piece in the Asian American Studies is that next fight. That is not just simply learning about that in law school class, which is a little late in the game relatively, you know, but it's about learning that context. And we'd love to.
Yeah. Should we throw it over?
Yes.
I think actually we should do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yes.
I have several thoughts, but thank you first and foremost. That was so interesting, very nuanced, and it expanded a lot of like my own understandings. I'm coming into this symposium as like a person practicing urban planning, right, and urban design, and so even though I'm not a legal scholar, I feel the balance of it and the frustrations of mostly like land use law in how it governs my profession. But I'm also curious, kind of like going back to sort of some of our end talking points just now about like how legal scholars might think about like belonging, right? The idea of belonging, the practice of belonging as something that is spatially produced, right? Through some of the land use law tools and mechanisms we talked about, like zoning, land use governance or laws, or even like redevelopment policies. You know, from your perspectives, what does it mean to like imagine these new legal geographies? And then also, I guess in some ways, I'm glad we talked about some of these, like the morphology of Asian American communities and spaces, the spaces of congregation, the yellow spaces. I really love that phrasing actually. And oftentimes like that are challenging this like Euclidean assumption or practice of land use as the norm, right? But what are these new legal geographies that allow Asian American communities to not just like exist, but really belong and thrive and come to that sort of self-determination with the built environment?
I love that question.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why that, as a New Yorker that spent a lot of time in LA, I've often thought that the Asian immigrants in LA, if they had a dream and they wanted a warehouse, all they had to do was get into their car and drive further east. And they could build themselves Panda Express. You know, they could build their headquarters, because as an East Coaster coming out, like, holy cow, there's nothing like that East Coast, because you can't build anything, because it costs you $7 trillion, and you've got to be a billionaire. But here, you've got 10 million, you know, 3 million, you could do it. And there was a physical space, even, you know, so what are the benefits of geographic sprawl? Was that you could build that dream. So there was like bigger space for that dream for Asian Americans, like, or immigrants here, in a way that in New York is high, like everything is like prepare for World War III, you know, to get past the community board.
You almost said World War IV.
I know, I did. I hope you're not passing, but I mean, you know, so, but things like that happen in New York, but it takes like 50 years. And even then, there's a massive battle about gentrification, what's happening in Flushing, which is sort of like, you know, Monterey Valley, you know, Monterey Park and things like that. So, I mean, I actually think so, therefore, that old dream of the American West is very true for Asian Americans. There's more space to have that dream. Of course, sprawl comes with it. But that's the way I've seen it personally. Whereas in New York, you go up against these sort of old interests, moneyed interests, physical space, you know, so I think that the space of the West has allowed Asian American communities and immigrant communities more space to do that dream. But that's,
If I may, yeah, I do want to say it's a great question. Thank you so much for raising it. I did want to bring into the conversation the work of Richard Kallenberg. I hope I got the first name right, it's been a while. And so, who was at the Century Foundation for a very long time and is now at the Progressive Foundation. And he's done a lot of great work about tying, because we're all siloized. I mean, that's what human beings do, right? It's our nature. And so he's saying that housing, right, advocates need to partner with educational advocates to really get into this space about upzoning, downzoning meaning less density, upzoning more density, right, in neighborhoods, and really to think through how they can partner to develop policies. I mean, he's specifically focusing on urban policies in New York City, but other locales as well. His reach is, national. To really, because that affects schooling, right? And if we stay in our lanes and we don't, meet and figure things out together, we're just not going to get there.
When you asked the question, which is a really good question, I was thinking a little bit about, and I'm glad that Chris raised the New York kind of experience of that. And so one thing I'll share is that we all live in like different spaces, and I have chosen to raise my children in not an integrated space, a mostly white space in the suburbs of New York City. And I live north of New York City, and this hasn't quite happened to my suburb and my school district, but I know that the ones that are east of the city in Long Island have experienced this. So all of that huge global investment has actually radically changed some of the high-performing public schools of Long Island, of Nassau County. And so I heard this only through kind of cocktail party chatter from, a Jewish man who had long raised his family in the public schools of Long Island, but how his last child, who was going through high school, was really feeling like alienated and really feeling excluded because she didn't speak Mandarin. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, oh, don't you know, like Syosset High School or whatever port, I don't remember all the names of them, but like out there is like 75, 80%, 90% Mandarin speaking now. And I'm like, what? Wow. And so sometimes the money is buying, right, the ability to build these spaces. And why Long Island, why not north of the city? Because for us to go to Flushing, we have to cross the bridge. They don't have to cross the bridge. But like, I don't know, but definitely the school part is certainly like first on their mind as to like where they're gonna live. And they will just take over a town or village if allowed.
Jerry.
Yeah, you mind if I just quickly respond? I'm a property professor, so when you said Euclidean zoning, can I give you a very quick theoretical answer? So I teach Euclidean zoning, and to me it's the most arbitrary thing that was affirmed by the US Supreme Court, right? So there's a system of where you can build stuff, what type of stuff you can build, and then prioritize single family housing. Why? It could be anything, it could be multifamily housing, right? But single family housing actually, it creates social stratification based on wealth and how much money you have. You mix that with something called racial zoning, which was legal in this country until 1948, where localities were just saying, okay, in our zoning regulations, we're gonna say white people can live here, and non-white people have to live in other places, prioritizing white people, right? There was racially restrictive covenants, redlining, block busting, steering. There's all these practices that the government knew about. Sometimes they sanctioned through their policies. So here's my kind of point. Why am I saying all this? Because sometimes belonging is constructed by law, and exclusion is constructed by law, maybe all the time, right? And so I think it's a mistake to say, look around and say, oh, look at these pockets of segregation, it's all self-imposed, personal preference, personal choice. My argument would be that has a tiny thing to do about it. It's the way the legal laws were created that facilitates this hypersegregation. And so here's the maybe point of hope. So if laws can be constructed in this way, right, it means they could be deconstructed, and you could use your imaginations. You could think, what could they look like to include lots more people? Right.
Can I make one point, and then we'll go to Jerry's?
Yeah.
In Flushing, which is like the Monterey Park of New York City, Chinese capital has funded like $100 million projects that have built apartments above malls, above restaurants, and they are filled with $1 million apartments in Flushing, where apartments used to cost $20,000, $40,000, 60, 70 years ago, and I'm very happy because my parents get to live in one of them. But like, and you know, they're 90, so they get to take the elevator down and get groceries and kind of live like they're in Hong Kong or in Asia. But it's creating all these problems. A lot of it is because Chinese capital in that period was flowing into America. It could rebuild that environment in a way that those Chinese immigrants wanted to like live their lives. But sure.
Hey, so I've been writing a chapter on how Asian American attorneys, elite attorneys, responded to the hate crime spike in COVID-19. And it's connected actually to the educational access competition question. So there was a group of lawyers called the Alliance that got activated, and it was Fortune 100 company GCs as well as managing partners who leveraged big pro bono institutional resources to actually provide direct legal assistance to victims of Asian hate. And that's why I talked to Albert Bragg's office and I talked to all these district attorneys, et cetera. But here's what's interesting, because I tried to get them to think, because it's not ordinary public interest lawyering or movement lawyering, because these were all private sector people. They were oftentimes very influential, rich. They had, in some ways, achieved the model minority training, in part because they hustled and all those things. But at this moment, they decided to flex their model minority muscle in a particular kind of way. But it led to some awkward situations, like suing Udine for violating Marcy's law, which is actually just a law that requires victims to get notice and have some ability to talk to the judge before sentencing. So the question, it's a long wind up, but the question is just, when lawyers were navigating, again, the kind of challenge of wanting to both help Asian American folks, whether it be in the education space or in the hate crime space, but they also recognize that doing so could create awkward politics. Because in some sense, the complaint is there's under-enforcement of hate crime laws against the Asian American victims, but we're all anxious about over-enforcement because of structural disparities that actually go after Black and brown people. And so writing that balance has been really challenging. The way I saw the lawyers that I've been studying process it, I thought there were two mindsets, and I just wanted to hear your reactions to these two mindsets. One was just activating very traditional role ideology about lawyers. Lawyers are just zealous advocates, they're litigators. So once you get a client, because they're not really thinking of it as impact litigation, once you get a client who's suffering, you do everything possible to help that client. And if that includes activating victims' rights laws, you activate victim rights laws, because your job is to help your client. And they were not especially thoughtful in a deep sense about it. They just said, you're my client, I have a fiduciary duty to you, I'm not gonna challenge that conception of lawyering, I'm just gonna go whole hog, litigate the fuck out of theirs, and beat anyone. If it's a district attorney, it's not gonna be the district attorney. So one is just being a zealous advocate. The other mindset that I saw, really interestingly, was this psychological need to say no more on the invisibility of being a model minority. Like, we suffer all the time. We paid our dues to like scrape ourselves to near the top, not the top, but near the top of a lot of a big law, and we're only visible as potential victims of hate crimes. We're just not going to take this anymore. And so it was just an act of self-defiance. But I don't even care now about what this means for greater racial politics. Because on this point, I'm going to be countertypical. I will no longer be submissive, which is the theme that actually activates and catalyzes the hate crimes to begin with. And so it was this kind of deep psychological need to be countertypical to the model minority stereotype. So it was an inversion of the model minority stereotype that I saw these lawyers groping for. They were like patent litigators, they were like making millions of dollars, but they decided to get activated in that way. So those two mindsets, was it lawyer as zealous advocate, and was it a deep felt need, almost a psychological, desperate need to reject the model minority submissive stereotype that was the cause of the violence in the first place? Reactions?
It's both. And you know, up until anti-Asian hate and when that was really hot, by being wealthy and being in that very specific world, you were really closed off from a lot of these concerns. Once anti-Asian hate became really hot, there was no way that your wealth and access could shape you, could shield you. And not only Asian American lawyers, but Asian American business people, the billionaires and the millionaires got into this space, and that's half the Asian American Foundation, right? So you're, obviously you're a law professor, so you're looking at the lawyers, but to me, it's like that lawyers, but also TAF. That's the same sort of reaction. Individuals who had never thought about race and only thought about wealth accumulation, or were in
But
the
that's just
fight.
a self-interest story in
Right.
some sense. So you finally see things when your house can burn. Yeah. So
Right.
yeah.
I actually think it is both those mindsets as well. And I want to, though, push back a little bit in the sense that when I think about, I don't know every instance that the Alliance worked on. I just know a couple of the instances that they worked on. I heard something about this suit. I thought it out in San Francisco, and I thought, wow, that's big time. But I want to say that there were definitely folks who were Alliance volunteers using their law firms and stuff who actually were and do think of themselves as a zealous advocate. They were lit on fire because of this rampant, freaking scary ass violence. I mean, I think there's some just like primitive kind of reaction there as well. But I also do think that many of them still held back some. So, and what became an interesting contrast was that on some of these cases in New York, there would be somebody who was really kind of connected to the case through the Alliance, and then there would be us who were not like the victims' lawyers, but we were the community. I feel like one of the community voices. And what ended up happening when you had multiple people kind of in that space was that we could be the bad cop liberal extremists who were like, no, goddammit, court watchings. We're gonna go out there and flood those courtrooms. And no, where is that indictment? Where is that arrest? Like, where are you on this? How could that be the plea bargain? Because those private lawyers were not always willing to go that far. And they didn't have to because kind of we did. And so there was a little bit of
So you were the bad cops.
I mean, there's specific.
Apologies.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm getting easily frustrated.
And Jerry, I didn't know you were working on the book, so we'll share all the things that we did. If you weren't aware, that we issued 2 reports, we have a documentary, and we did all this behind the scenes lobbying with different DAs in New York City, because we didn't identify a fluency with Asian Americans as hate crime victims. Like, it just didn't exist in the mind of the president.
We needed the DA still to return somebody's calls, and if they would keep, the good cop. So we would need to know when things were happening. There's so much power over information, right? And so it became kind of like a de facto, multiple person effort. But so I just want to say, like, they largely, I think, were still very careful and deliberate about what they did. Maybe not all of them. Maybe there's somebody who just went like Rambo on this, but I don't.
Yeah, no, it was just interesting. I didn't realize that you thought you were the bad cops and they were the good cops, because they were also criticized for being the bad cops, compared to even on a left-right spectrum.
That's
but,
right.
But I don't
That's
think we
right.
monopolize the conversation. But I'll send
No,
you.
but
No, this is the conversation.
I wanted to say, just to build on that, New York City has had kind of a moment, right? Since 2021, since COVID, since the pandemic of hate, in political and civic participation, and it's ongoing now. Now it's no big deal that there might be 10 Asian American, including multiracial Asian Americans, on the New York City City Council, right? Because
But
it's
including
2021.
Republicans, though.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not. I get that. And so, but I think that this idea, I'm going to push back on this idea of self-interest, not just with the lawyers who you interview, but with the people who are really going out there, right? And it could be Republican on all sides politically. Is it only self-interest, or is it that, hey, yeah, we are pissed, and we've been invisible for so long, and we should be part of the conversation, wherever the conversation takes us, right, in terms of racial and socioeconomic and ethnic inequalities in the United States, right? And we should be part of that conversation, and maybe what we share, I'm not saying we, right, but them, right? Maybe what they share isn't gonna be so comfortable, isn't gonna be just convenient or fun. Is it ever? I mean, and if they're gonna be part of it, then they have to be part of it.
And then the other, I mean, that alliance might be fairly defunct at this point, you know, to be honest, right? You know, it was just, this is being recorded, right? So it's gonna make a lot of people.
Sorry, you still
You know,
unpleasant
and as it turned out, like, it just used a lot of the pro bono sort of activities of like corporate law firms.
Matchmaking, yeah.
And I went through like the calls with some of them people, and you know, it was like these like second years at like corporate law firms, like, all right, thanks, bye. You know, like, you know, one interview and that's it, right? We think we did something different out of the task force. But then beyond the lawyers looking at TAF, the Asian American Foundation, you have a lot of people that were engaged in the space now after that in a way that they weren't, and I think there's a lot of problems maybe, but there's a lot of resources and people in the movement in a way that was never existed before. And I think that's an interesting sort of perspective as going forward to help shape that and to see where it's going. That might be one of the benefits of what's coming out, but I think that's still in process, so.
All right, I think we're at time.
And I'd love to continue this, but thank you so much.
Thank you.